Welcome to my little Lord of the Rings abode. I'm up in the mountains, Mount Glorious near Brisbane. Very beautiful, tranquil place where I've come to integrate some of the experiences I've had over the last 7 years, which sounds ambitious. It wasn't really conscious. I only realized when I came up here that that's what I was doing. And I wanted to share it with people who have experienced this this experience that is called psychosis sometimes, and often gets led to a diagnosis of mental illness, which was my experience. So I haven't made really any personal videos or videos on my personal experience so far. So this is the first one, and I suppose I feel called now to share what I've been realizing and learning over the last 7 years particularly, because there's so many people that are struggling with these diagnoses and these experiences, and there's not a lot of context for it. I feel like the medical model is sometimes leading people astray into thinking that there's something wrong with them, when really, if you're having such an experience, or you've had one in the past, and you're now recovering or trying to understand what that means, I want to encourage you and inspire you, perhaps with my story, to see what has happened to you as one of the most incredible gifts that can be given to a person for their spiritual growth. Now, spiritual growth is not something everybody with mental illness identifies with as being what they are going through, is a spiritual experience. I've worked now in mental health for about 5 or 6 years, and it's like any illness, it affects a very broad spectrum of people, from very, what might you say, people who are very rational and reasonable, so much to the point where they deny anything that's intuitive or spiritual or can't be seen and touched and measured and quantified, all the way through to very idealistic thinkers, people who are extremely emotional, very sensitive, very intuitive, very psychic often. So this broad spectrum, this may not be the truth for all of those people who have psychosis, and that's fine. I think we're living in an incredible time when divergent views are possible. Just because one view is right for somebody does not invalidate that view for somebody else. So whatever your experience is, whatever your truth is, that's always what I encourage people to investigate and follow and find out for themselves. So what I'm going to share in this video and in any subsequent videos that I make will be about my truth, and in sharing my truth, perhaps it inspires greater insight into your own truth. So what you're always looking for when you're listening to anybody who claims to be a teacher is the little spark inside of you which ignites when you hear something that's true for you. So that will be felt if you tune in, if you practice this. You will feel it in your heart, a stirring, a fluttering. Sometimes it's quite dramatic, sometimes it makes us cry. When you hear your truth, tears can come, goosebumps can break out on your skin, and you'll just know. And it's this deep, deep knowing which is the golden thread that you can follow to your highest destiny. Now that's a tricky concept because even destiny itself is we're not all agreed that there is such a thing, and I will explore that a lot in my videos, because that's something that I'm very interested in. My journey has taken me through the practical, I've been in the trenches of a mental breakdown, psychological breakdown, all the way through to very, very lofty spiritual heights. And I want to explore the breadth of that and see where this takes us. So that's my way of saying what resonates, keep, what doesn't, discard. And so it is with everything. I'm up here in the hills because I've come to the end. It feels a completion of a very important cycle of disintegration and rejuvenation and healing, which has happened in my life. It started 7 years ago, quite literally 7, which is a very powerful number in spirituality. It's the number of initiation. If you look at mythology, there's often 7 stages that a person needs to go through before they are allowed to enter the higher realms, or in some cases the lower realms. 7 doors, 7 portals. So 7 years is an important number, and it was almost exactly 7 years ago that I had a total breakdown of mind, body, spirit. It was called psychosis, and it was the most frightening, disabling thing that ever happened to me. It was very unexpected when it occurred. I had a life of relative misery, we could say, that so many people experience on the planet today. Generalized misery, always feeling that there was something wrong. I guess I always thought the word neurosis fit really well, neurotic. So that's kind of the preceding stage to psychosis. There's a really lovely quote by, I think it's Arthur Yanoff, who writes a lot about what he called primal therapy. He was the founder of primal therapy. Dr. Arthur Yanoff says that psychosis is what happens when neurosis doesn't work anymore. So my neurosis, my neurotic personality that I had carried around for 36 years, got to the point where it could no longer hold the tension that had just built up inside of me over years and years. This generalized misery, this feeling of unease and tension, incredible tension, because underneath my conscious awareness was deep, deep conflicts and a lot of trauma and a lot of fear. So these things are emotional, and emotion is energy. Emotions are energy. So the more that gets shoved down there and buried, the kind of more volatile it becomes. And it will always find a way to express itself eventually. For a lot of us, we find expression in very destructive ways when we haven't integrated those negative emotions. So we might try to suppress it with drinking or overworking or anything that feels addictive or compulsive or numbs these feelings. And I had my fair string of those problems. I felt like I was always going into one addiction and I would just get out of it and try to fix myself, and then I would slide into another one. So I didn't have serious drug addictions, I guess minor ones in a way. I was addicted to marijuana early in my life, just for a few years, and then I got out of that, and I found I had some problems with food as well, addictions to eating. I had addictions to exercise. Somehow I managed to turn what is supposed to be a healthy thing into a very unhealthy thing. just always recognizing, and like I said, none of these things got out of control, but I always recognized that they were controlling me. That was, I knew that I didn't have control. And drinking as well, same kind of thing. So that was what was manifesting in this 36-year period of generalized misery, as I call it. And I kind of came close to having a mental breakdown in my early 20s with a diagnosis of possible schizophrenia. It was developing schizophrenia. That's what the doctor said, that I should be careful. And at that time I engaged with a psychiatrist, and he told me, it wasn't a very fruitful encounter, but the one thing he did tell me that was very useful was to stop smoking marijuana, which I did immediately, so that was helpful. But like I said, I never solved the problem, so it was a continuation that kind of haunted me for those 36 years. And then age 36, I was actually rating myself as being very well at that period in my life. I had a very stable relationship with my husband, who I had been with since I was 22, so we had a long-term relationship. I was working, and I was practicing a beautiful yoga called Surat Shabad Yoga, which involved a lot of meditation and quite a strict, disciplined life. So I wasn't drinking, I wasn't eating meat, and I was meditating. And I felt very well. I actually felt joy bubbling up, often because of this practice. But something was still kind of haunting me, and at the time I was writing a screenplay, and I had chosen a very dark subject to write about a kickboxer, which is something I've practiced in my life. I really loved kickboxing and martial arts. So I wrote this very dark screenplay about this subject, and somehow my creative writer's mind came up with a storyline about a kickboxer who was boxing because he was abused in his childhood. So I was researching abuse, and I was finding that I was getting quite triggered by the subject. Somehow it kind of cracked open my heart. It cracked open the defenses. It laid bare, or exposed to me, the pain that was actually in my psyche. And writers, we do our very best to hide ourselves behind our fictional stories. I was a fantasy writer. I wrote about fantasy. What's that got to do with me? Everything. If you have a look at my fantasy books, you'll see at that time the darkness and the quest to find the self, and also the themes of the father. The themes of the father came up again and again for me, and I will talk more about those in videos later. But suffice to say that the subject matter was very disturbing to me, and so I found myself feeling really angry, and I identified that feeling, and I went along to a counsellor. Believe it or not, even with all my generalized misery, age 36, I'd never actually gone to a counsellor. So this was a new experience for me. And very, very nice counsellor who I clicked with immediately. And perhaps it was that rapport which led to, I guess, I felt like he could see me, and I felt like he could see right through me into that pain. And it only took 4 sessions with this counsellor to crack open the shell which was encasing that pain for me. And it was like a shell. It was like as if he just went tap, tap, tap on the shell, and the whole thing cracked. And how that looked in the counselling room was, he asked me to visualize my childhood. Just close my eyes and visualize my childhood. And I did this, and I went deep within. And that smallness and that feeling of powerlessness is what suddenly did it. And all of a sudden, I felt terror, sheer terror, flooding in to my consciousness. The terror was so great that I leapt from my chair and I hid in the corner of the office, trembling, shaking, and hearing voices. The voices were, I can't really remember what they were saying, other than that they were very scary. They were very loud in my head and they were very scary. And this counsellor, well, he did his best to calm me down, and I went out of his office, but I was never the same. That day was a big day of great change for me in my life. What followed was 3 months of unmedicated psychosis. When you have a clear psychotic break like that, it is an overwhelming experience. It's like being catapulted from reality into an alternative reality. You know, I kind of thought, I intuited that it was a spiritual experience, but I didn't have a lot of context for that. I was filled with fear, and there was a great deal of energy influx that was coming into me. I felt very expanded. That was one of the hallmarks of a psychotic experience, or any kind of altered state of consciousness like that, is that the consciousness itself has expanded. So if you can imagine the ego as a kind of a shell, like a little egg that's protecting us from the totality, because the totality of experience, of life, of the life force, is extremely potent, powerful energies, and to the uninitiated, quite terrifying. So the ego, which is our sense of our identity and our personality and who we think we are, is this egg that we kind of are cocooned in and sit in to keep us from the sheer influx of that energy. And this had fallen apart. This was the story of Humpty Dumpty falling apart and suddenly being completely exposed to this influx of energy. It's called madness. But madness is misunderstood, greatly misunderstood by most people, and certainly the medical model, because experiences like these are pathologized immediately. It's an illness, it's a bad thing, it's a disorder, it shouldn't be happening, it's wrong, there's something wrong. I find it interesting now, knowing what I know now, to look back and think that if I had lived in a different culture, perhaps in a more spiritual community of people, or in a shamanic culture, indigenous cultures around the world, that this experience would have been recognized as the spiritual breakthrough that it was, and the shamans, the ones that have come to their powers, have come to it via these kinds of breakdowns. This is exactly the sign of the shaman, is to have had an ego dissolution, complete disintegration of the ego. It's actually something to be greatly celebrated, and while it looks terrifying, and it is terrifying, and you know, the person needs a great deal of support, it is also the start of potentially the healing for that person. And that has been the story for me. So 7 years ago, I was having this experience of psychosis, breakdown. I remember going to a retreat, sort of a self-initiated retreat. It was a friend of mine that owned a little cabin in the middle of nowhere kind of thing. His house was attached to it though, so I went along and I stayed in the cabin, and I was going through my stuff. I wasn't sleeping. I was making a lot of art. I was communing with the universe. I was terrified. It certainly wasn't pleasant. And I had no context. I had no idea what was happening, and I didn't trust it either. And so now, you know, in honor of the long journey that it has been for me, here I am 7 years later on another retreat. And this is the little place that I've come to in the mountains, in Mount Glorious. And I'm undergoing another transformation right now. A lot of energy is coming into my being. My consciousness is being greatly expanded, especially in the last 6 months, although it's been probably about 2 years ago when I really started to notice this energy coming in, and I started to be able to master it. And this is the key. It actually, I've learned what I've needed to learn to handle this amount of energy, to ground myself, to be able to work with it in a masterful way. And that is the journey of the shaman. So these videos I want to present as, I guess, like I said, inspiration maybe, that may not even be the right word. It's not as if I want to put myself up on a pedestal. It's more just an invitation to reconsider what you're going through if you've experienced these kinds of things. And I'm going to talk a lot more in detail about them. I'm planning to design some kind of an online course where I explain all the different aspects of psychosis, because there are so many of them and I can't go into them in this much detail in this video. Suffice to say, there is a lot to understand, there is a lot to appreciate. If you haven't ever heard that psychosis may be a healing crisis, then I invite you to look at this with fresh eyes and look at it with the heart, because the heart has so much deep wisdom that the mind does not. And the reason the mind does not have that wisdom is because the mind, it's a beautiful tool, but it only is as good, its output is only as good as its input. So we have had input into our minds, especially in Western society, maybe not other cultures, but we've had this input of illness, psychosis as illness, mental breakdown as illness. A deep fear is encoded within that discourse of anything that is uncomfortable, suffering. You know, I mean, we live in a culture where you have a headache and the first thing you do is reach for a Panadol, without tuning into the body and respecting the body and asking the body what is the cause and how to resolve. So similarly with psychosis, what is the cause and how to resolve? And all that we need is within us. Everything, absolutely everything. The power that we each have is indescribable. I'm only just stepping into that power now, in a way that I can live it. You know, I think it's one thing to understand it, and it's definitely another to live it and embody it and take the heart-centered wisdom that doesn't require input from others for it to have knowledge and for it to be able to use that knowledge. So heart is our intuition. I guess that's what you could call it, equate it with. Heart is intuition. And heart is the receiver. Heart is the intersection between the earthly world and the higher realms, is this area here. So this is the part that will speak most truthfully to us. And this is the part that you can tune into to decide what you would like to expose yourself to, what knowledge, what experiences, what understanding. So I wish you well, fellow travellers. I hope to be here as much as possible. I hope to try to, guide as best I can. And we're all guiding each other. We're all a big team of people learning at the moment, and there's an incredible learning going on this planet at this time. So we have the internet to thank as well for allowing us to share and bring these messages forth. So we'll leave it there, otherwise it will get too long and no one will want to watch. So thank you for listening so far, and I hope to see you again soon. Namaste.